So hey, my name is Guðmundur. You can find me on all the social medias under this handle. I'm here going to talk about using GitHub Actions. I'm a software engineer on the team that's been building Actions, and we've been working on this for quite a few months now. So the talk is going to be split into two different parts. It's the using Actions part, which is how you as a customer use it. And then secondly, I'm going to go into how to build Actions. So if you want to contribute to the community of Actions, then I'll get into that. To showcase some of this stuff, I'm going to start with some simple demos. The first one is starting from this pretty empty repository, where I'm going to show how if you push a commit to this repository, it is just going to say hello. So it's going to show it in the logs behind Actions. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we do here, we create a new file in the repository, and we type the name .github/main.workflow. And it'll show you this thing on the right-hand side saying show visual editor. And this shows you this UI here. And the first thing at the top there is the workflow. And we can call that say hello on push, which is what the end state that we want to get to. And then we can drag this blue dot down here, and it'll put an action onto the canvas. So the one I'm going to use is for a shell. So it's basically just running shell commands. And we can name that echo hello, and then a special thing, which is a GitHub actor, which is whoever is pushing the code to this repository. So this particular workflow, it needs a special thing. So I'll get back to that one later, why we're doing this. But it puts brackets around the arguments here. So let's commit this to a branch called say hello, and then give it a nice commit message, which is same as before, say hello and push. So now that we push this, we just want to go ahead and create a pull request for it. And you can see now that it's been queued, and then in a tiny bit, it's going to say in progress, which means that it's running. And then, boom, there you go. It's run the thing now. And if you click the check mark there, we'll see the logs for the action. And we'll see that it says hello Guðmundur down there. So this action here is in this file here. So this is where you configure Actions. This is where you put your workflows and actions for GitHub Actions. So the one I just showed you, this is the config file for it. So it's not just the UI that you can use to do this. You can also type it out if you want to. And the two concepts here are workflows and actions. And if we take a little step back, then we can actually see that these have special things in them. They have a meaning. And we also added this thing where you can add comments. So for all you people that love JSON as configs, we have comments in this one. So let's take a look at workflows and see what they're all about and how to use them. So the first thing there is that they have an identifier. So this is just any string. You can put emojis, anything you want. The only condition is that it's globally unique within that file that you have. The second part is the event name. So that is any event that we showed here earlier. So these are generally events that act on the repository. So this is anything from creating issues, creating pull requests, pushing to the repository, commit statuses, whatever. And the resolve statements, which is the next thing, that is basically what the target state is. So for example, if you want a workflow to deploy something, you would say the deploy action here. I'll get back into how you chain actions together in a little later. But if what you're after is just resolving a single action, you can do it by dropping the array notation. The demo I showed before was on push, we would say hello. But we're actually adding another thing, which is new around actions, which is repository dispatch. And that is basically you can invoke actions and workflows with API calls. The way that works is that we have a new endpoint, which is in the REST API currently. You post to this endpoint on api.github.com / all of this repository stuff, and then /dispatch at the end. And you can give it this JSON payload, which is going to show up in the event when the actions run. So you can set up filters which use this event type there to distinguish which workflow it should actually trigger. So this was workflows. Let's have a look at actions. Actions are kind of where all of this juicy stuff happens in workflows. the visual representation here is like you have the workflow on top and then actions beneath it. And this is what we're also recommending for the workflow files that you create. So leave all the workflows at the top and then the actions beneath it and group them based on what workflow they're part of. So the action I showed before is this one here. So similarly, like if we take a bit of a step back, we see that this is basically the simplest form of it. The uses is the only thing that's required. And it has an identifier, like the workflows, and it's the same namespace, so you can call them whatever you want, but they just have to be unique. And this is when you refer to actions, this is the identifier for that. So here, I'm going to take a bit of a step back and show you all of the optional arguments or the optional keywords for actions. So let's go ahead and click the edit link here on the action. And you can see there is actually a handful of them. So I'm going to scroll down here. And what we can do now is we can see that these are all the attributes that are available in the action. To kind of give you an idea what you use all of these for, I'm going to set up a small example repository. So I'm going to illustrate like what you actually use all these for rather than trying to explain it. I think that's probably an easier way to do it. So this is a simple Node.js app, which just has a single endpoint. When you hit that, it will tell you hello world. It has a package.json along with it, which contains which dependencies this app uses, and then which scripts you can run with it. It also has a tests directory, where it has a single test for this particular repository, and then an ESLint file to lint the code in the repository. And finally, like what we want to do is do npm install on this repository using actions, and then do npm test and run lint in parallel. And then finally, as like a cherry on top, we want to deploy it to site. So let's go ahead and set up this workflow. We create the main.workflow like we did before. And there's a nice visual tweak that we did as well, that there's a full screen button up here. So it looks even nicer. Like before, we're going to go ahead and name this workflow. So let's call it deploy on push. So it's going to pick up pushes to like any branch. And I'll get back to how you can actually configure it to do like on different branches. First thing was npm install. So let's go ahead and label that build, because that's kind of the general concept that we're doing here. And click done. And then let's drag this further on and add another npm action here from the featured list. Call that tests, and that's going to run npm test. So the things in the featured thing, that's what we were talking about earlier about like open source actions. So we have a handful of them now, but we'll be adding more, and hopefully the community as well. So the last step I mentioned was deploying to site. And for that, I'm going to name this deploy. There we go. And then finally, we're going to enable the site token here. So that is going to be injected for this action. And the last thing I mentioned was running a linter in parallel with the test action there. So it's still using npm, but instead of doing test, we just say run lint. And the last thing, we only want the deployment to happen if both of these succeed. So again, let's go ahead and commit this. There you go. And open up a pull request. And since this is a pre-recorded demo, I've sped it up a bit. But the first step here is doing the build. And that takes about a minute in real life, but in this demo, it's just a few seconds, so you don't have to wait for that to happen. You can see that lint and test, they're going to show up as green about the same time. There we go. And then the deployment is the last thing that's going to happen. There we go. What's interesting about this demo is not that it's just a Node.js app. It could be anything. It could be a Ruby gem. It could be an npm package that you want to deploy somewhere. Or it could be building a Docker container and pushing that to a registry. So this is just like a typical example of like what you would be doing, but the details of like what particular components, you could basically put anything in there. So to show that it's been deployed, I head over to the site website, and that shows that the process is actually running. And if we click the link to visit the site, we will see hello world, which is what we were after. The workflow, again, that I showed through all of this is this thing here. And the needs block that I showed you before, that's the thing that declares dependencies between these. So the deploy step, the last thing, that is going to say that it needs test and lint. And then test and lint, they are going to say that they need build. And the build doesn't have any dependencies, so that is the first thing that we're going to kick off. And we have this like dependency graph of what is going to happen, and then that's the thing we execute. So the config file behind all of this is this thing here. And as I just explained about the need statement, you can also see at the top that it says resolves deploy. So it starts by going all the way down to the action deploy and figuring out that that's the thing that we want to converge at, and then it can like build up the tree from there. Another thing that you probably don't want to do is to actually deploy every push that you do to your production system. So you could basically set up another workflow block like the one that you have at the top, and that would just say test and lint in the resolve statement. And this one would still be just deploy, but there's a concept that we've been building in which is called filters. So you could say that only pushes to master are going to deploy, but anything else is just going to run test and lint. A nice side effect of that is that it allows us to do all sorts of optimizations. So for example, when you push something to a branch, and then deploy and then merge it, we don't need to do all of the intermediate steps. We can actually do optimizations where we like grab the results from those and then push them forward. So that was the need statement. And similar to some of the other ones, if it's only a single thing that you have, you can actually drop the brackets for that. So this is how you do like the dependency resolution and specify dependencies between everything. So now we're going to get a bit into like detail. So what is the thing that actually runs an action? The short answer is Docker, but it's a bit more convoluted than just that. The first thing here is that we can pull images from a Docker registry. The second one, you can point it at any repository on GitHub that's public. And the last form is anything that's in the current repository. So let's go through each one of these and talk a bit about that. So in this case, we will just be pulling down Debian from Docker Hub. And by itself, it needs an entry point. It doesn't specify one, so you have to tell it what to run. And I'll show a demo of how to do that in a bit. If you want to be pulling an image from a private repository, you would need a preceding action to that, which does a Docker login to that particular registry. The second form is this one here, pointing at a public repo on GitHub. And this is the one I showed you earlier with a shell. But we've actually opened up an organization on GitHub called github.com/actions. And we've posted a few repositories there with actions. We're going to be adding more. So the ones we have now are these here. This was when I checked it last night. The action builder is an action that helps you build other actions. So it's a thing that will lint your actions. It will run tests on them if you have them. The bin one just has a handful of command line tools that you are likely to use with actions. Then we got the three big clouds, which we showed earlier in the demo. That's Google Cloud, Azure, and AWS. And you can use that for anything from deploying to Kubernetes, uploading static assets to a bucket, whatever you can think of. Then we have Docker and NPM. So those are like the examples of building things and publishing to a registry. And at the bottom, we've got Site and Heroku if you want to deploy to a SaaS. The bin directory has a few things, and I'll take a bit of a deeper dive into one of them later on. But if we look at the filter one, which is the one I'll look closer at, I'm just going to take like a tiny look into that. And we can see that, I hope you can see it, there is a Dockerfile up there. So that is the thing, like if we're not pulling images from a Docker registry, we are actually looking for a Dockerfile. And if you find one, we will build that and run that as the action. The last form is kind of similar. So it'll basically just look in the current repository, and if there's a Dockerfile, it'll build that. So this is where we are thinking that there are some actions which don't necessarily make sense to publish publicly. So these are like one-offs, things that are only like relate to this particular repository and don't really have a broader purpose other than that. And this example, this is just a demo we have, and there's a Dockerfile, and there's also a Ruby file there. So that is kind of to illustrate that you can write your actions in any language that you can think of. The filter demo is just shell scripts. This one is Ruby. We have a few in other languages as well. So with Docker images, we need to run them somehow. It's not just enough to pull it down. You have to call some command on it. So with the example before of pulling down Debian, I said you had to like give it a command to run. So this is how you would do that. If you're not all like happy about the bracket syntax, you can actually use this, which is a shorthand for the other thing. And the demo I mentioned earlier is just pulling down a Docker image from Debian and then running find dot, which will show you the contents of the current directory. Similarly, there are arguments. So if a Docker image specifies an entry point, which is something that we highly recommend when building actions, you can just pass the arguments directly in. So this is, again, you can specify it in this form. And the example I've been giving a few times is this, where you can have an npm action, and the argument is just to install. You don't need to write npm install every time. This particular example I gave you here, it uses the array notation, but it's for the shell action. And that expects that every argument that you pass in is a standalone command. So if you want to run like 10 different shell commands in a sequence, you can just add them to this array, and it'll run them. And if one of them fails, it'll fail the entire flow. Secrets, that's another super cool concept. Just going to get some water. You all doing all right? Cool. So we mentioned the secrets vault earlier. So rather than persisting tokens in a repository and possibly encrypting them in there, we're adding this thing called the secret vault. And the way that works is, in the demo I gave earlier, I passed in a site token. So from the GitHub UI, you can actually specify a token. And that is going to be available only for the action that has it specified as a secret. So any other action that's running won't be able to see this. In the demo that I gave you earlier, it was already persisted in the repository. But right here on the right-hand side, you can see that there's a secret section, and there is a GitHub token thing there. So if you check that box, then an action will actually get a GitHub token that it can use to make calls back to GitHub. There are some other cool use cases, and I'll get back to one of them in a bit. But let's click the Create a New Secret button here and type in site token, and the token is nice try. And let's add that. And this is basically how you set a token for an action. There's also this other thing where you can specify environment variables. So this is useful for cases. For example, with AWS, you want to specify which region it's supposed to use. Then you can do that by doing this. The environment variables, they're going to be passed to the process that's running. And we actually add a few more. And I'll get, again, to that in a bit. So this was the last thing with actually running actions and using them. So building actions, that's the second half of the talk. And the way that works is basically Dockerfile. That's like what I've alluded to a few times now. So when we run actions, it's actually Docker containers that we run. We just orchestrate how they get run. And the filters action that I mentioned earlier, that has a few things in its Dockerfile, and those are things that we are recommending that people put in there. The first thing to notice is the first line, which is from Debian. That is a thing that we're recommending that people do for actions. So we don't have like something from Ubuntu, something from Debian, something from all sorts of places. which is going to make things slower. So we basically say, if you can, please use Debian, because then like things will pull down faster. And use slim images if possible. And then give them a name, give them a maintainer, and then importantly, give them a version, which is just the semantic versioning. And then we also have these 4 labels, 4 actions. And when we show the card in the UI, that is the thing that actually gives it the description and the icon and the color. The entry point here is also quite important. Remember the demo with the echo hello world or hello my name? For the expansion to happen from going from GitHub actor to the actual value, we recommend that you put a shell as an entry point. Yeah. So this is how we build the action, but how do we actually run it? Like, what do we pass to it? What do we give it? So there is the environment around the Docker container that is running. And there are a few aspects to that. There's both the file system, and then there's also the environment variables that the processor is going to see. For both of those, we are specifying the GitHub preface as reserved. So we're going to be injecting things there that are going to affect the lifetime of your action. Furthermore, we can split this into the immutable environment and then the mutable one. So the immutable one is going to be scoped to this particular action, and anything you do there, like it won't bubble up anywhere else. And the mutable one is like where we persist things across actions. So whatever you change there, that is going to show up in all the subsequent actions. So the environments that we pass to the action is this. You can see here at the top that we give you the repository that the action is running for. And then we also give you a ref. So that is going to be the branch that it's running on. If it's an event based on a tag, we'll have the tag name there. If it's something that neither has a tag or a branch, like this GitHub ref is going to be absent. But then you also have the SHA of the commit. Now, for events that don't have anything to do with code, for example, issues and issue comments, we're just going to use the default branch. And the event name, that's what is the event that's actually triggering the workflow. And you can see the actor, that's just my name, and that's my GitHub login. Workflow, that's the name of the workflow. Action, the name of the current action. One thing to note here is you don't really get access to the workflow file itself, because we're basically thinking that the action shouldn't have to parse the file itself and figure out what's going on in there. Like, that's on us. We'll take care of that. And you just take what inputs you need and produce the outputs that you want to pass on. The 3 last ones are basically file system pointers. So they point to things on the file system. And the first one there is the event.json. And that is going to be the payload of the event that triggered the workflow. So let's have a look at that. And rather than digging through the webhooks for a specific repo, I just set up an action that looks like this. So it just uses the shell action again, and it calls cat, which will open up any file and just output its contents to the screen. And I'm looking at the GitHub event path. And when we run this action, it basically gives me the push event that triggered the thing. So this is super useful for actions that you maybe want to look into something about the event that triggered the thing. So if you're looking for something specific, for example, was this a push that deleted a branch, then you would be looking into the event payload for that. The mutable environment, that is basically everything you write to these particular places, they're going to be persisted across actions. The first one is the workspace. So that is going to be this directory. And that's going to be the working directory for actions. So when your Docker container runs, it's going to be, if you do ls dot, you're going to see the contents of that directory. So that directory contains a git clone of your repository. And it's going to be checked out at whatever branch or tag or commit that the event is based off. And there are a few things that with a git clone that are super intriguing. Like, most people are used to using them in CI and stuff like that for inspecting the repository. But there's a use case that I think is going to be super cool when people start to use it. And that is, with the GitHub token that I showed as a secret earlier, we can actually use that to push code back to GitHub. So for example, if you could have a workflow where you say, if I need to do code generation, and if I, as a developer, forget to do that locally, and then I push changes to GitHub, you can have a workflow which detects that you forgot to run the code generation, run it for you, commit it, and then push it back to GitHub. And that, to me, is like, that's what automation is all about. Like, computers should be taking care of that. Yeah, so the next thing is the home. So that's the next part of the immutable environment. And that is just a classical home directory in Unix, except that it's in /github/home. And that's because we're going to be doing a few things with it, which are like technical details. But you can ask me later what that's all about. And the intent there is that's where you're going to be putting credentials and configuration. So when you use command line tools, some of them need to write credentials to a file. So the default with, for example, Heroku, I believe NPM does it as well, and Docker, they'll write credentials to a file on the file system. You don't want to put that alongside your source code, because if you're building a container and then deploying that somewhere, you don't actually accidentally want to be putting tokens in there. So that's what the home directory is for. But we also have a git config in there and a credential helper. So that's a thing I mentioned. If you just pass a GitHub token to an action, you can actually use that to push back to GitHub. And that's how Git picks that credential up, or that token. And that's generally what we're recommending when you're building actions, that you read them from the environment and then pass them to whatever tool you have that way. So then everything else on the file system inside the container, it is mutable. You can modify it, but once the action is actually finished running, like, it's just going to be thrown away. So if you need to write temporary data anywhere, you can just do that. If you want to delete everything inside the container, you can also do that. But as soon as you touch anything in the home or the workspace, then it's going to be gone. So please don't do that. The last thing around building actions is exit codes. That's how we detect whether it's a successful action run or whether it's a failure. So as with any Unix program, if you exit with a 0, it's considered successful. Anything else, a failure. So this is like the check mark that you'll see in the GitHub UI after the action runs, or the X, which is not happy about things. So filters, I've mentioned them a bunch. So I'm just going to show you a tiny bit of how they're actually implemented. So we have this repository here, and which is a path inside this bin repository. And I mentioned also that you can say, we can have an action that filters based on a branch. I'm going to go a bit like a long-winded way around it, because it's simpler to show the code for it. But instead of saying in the args here, I'm saying ref, but you could actually say branch and just give it master. There's also one for tag. There's a few of them. But here I'm just saying ref, and then ref's heads master, which is the Git notation for a branch called master. If you look at the repository again, we can see there's a Dockerfile, which I showed you already. If you look at that, it's basically the same contents as I showed you before, but there's a few extra things in here. It's copying in some licenses and some documentation into the root of the file system. It's also installing a few packages. If you squint, you can maybe say that it's installing JQ, which is a tool for parsing JSON files and running queries against them. So there are a few filters that will do that. So there's a filter, for example, to inspect if you have an issue, you can see, was it opening an issue, closing an issue? And then similarly with pull requests, was it being opened or closed? And then lastly, it also copies some bin files into user local bin and then adds that to the path. And the last thing is that it runs a shell, and that was for the expansions that I mentioned earlier. So let's have a look inside the bin directory. And there are a few scripts in here. I mentioned branch and tag, and they basically call the ref one, which is kind of why I went the long-waited round. So let's look at the ref one. It's just a simple shell script. it's looking at the GitHub ref, which is going to contain the branch name or tag name. So the first thing it's checking is it actually set? If it isn't, it does an exit 1, which is a failure. So that's going to stop the workflow. If it actually matches the pattern you're looking for, so that's like refs head master, then it'll exit with a 0, which is success, and then it'll continue with the workflow. And then last thing is like it doesn't match the pattern, and then it just exits with a failure as well. So this is basically how you can use actions and build them, but there's like tons of details, which once you get into the beta, you'll get the documentation, which contains a bunch of things. So if you want to sign up, you can go to github.com/features/actions. If you have questions, I've got a bunch of the team from the actions team up here. So please come to the front of the stage. I always find it super intimidating to ask questions through the entire audience. So yeah, thank you for your time and attention. And I hope you have fun with actions.